Hello, ladies. So, there's two topics pending, and for ad and PR, I'm going to send you guys the PDF file in which you have a lot of jargon that you have to go through, based on which you'll be able to answer a lot of ad and PR related questions. But in this video, I'm going to talk about research methodology. I'm going to give you guys an overview of research methodology so that you're able to answer any question that is about mass media research. Right now, when we're talking about research methodology, you'll have research methodology questions in paper 1 as well as paper 2. In paper 1, it will be about general social sciences research, and in paper 2 it's going to be media related research. Right, so what I'm going to skip is all the stuff that you've probably prepared for paper 1, where there is a description of what are the different types of research, how do you understand quantitative, how do you understand qualitative and stuff. And I'm just going to jump straight to CRM, communication research methodology. Right now, quickly talking to you guys about some things you will need to know at any cost. One thing is that there are two basic types of research, right? One is quantitative, one is qualitative. Quantitative research deals with quantifying, basically getting the numbers in place as to how many people or how many advertisements or how many, etc. If you're talking about how many, we are talking about quantitative. Qualitative research, on the other hand, does not look at just quantifying it, but looks at trying to answer a research question, that is looking at analyzing data in terms of analyzing posts on social media or interviewing experts and trying to get an opinion on something, stuff like that. Right, so basically you have these two types, and one common thing, one very general mistake that people make is ending up writing a hypothesis for quantitative research. For qualitative research, please remember, for quantitative research you have a hypothesis. For qualitative research you have research questions. Right, now what is a hypothesis? We have discussed in the previous classes. I'm sure Ankita and Ayantika were there for those classes, but Shuli wasn't there, so I'll just repeat it anyway. When we are trying to construct a hypothesis, one thing that we are going to have is variables. Right, a variable is anything that changes with time. Right, it'll be in a particular state X today, it'll turn into state Y tomorrow. That is a variable. It varies. That's why it's called a variable. Right, for example, temperature is a variable, weather is a variable, mood is a variable, and shape of an object, if it changes with respect to time, that is a variable. Like football, for example, it's a variable because as soon as you remove air, it changes its shape. Like that, anything in nature that changes with time is called a variable. Right, and the concept of variable was first introduced in physical sciences. It was borrowed into social sciences much later because the logic remains the same. When we are trying to construct a hypothesis, it has to contain two important things. One is the independent variable, another is the dependent variable. And what a hypothesis does for qualitative researchers is to assess the effect of the independent variable on the dependent variable. Within these two names, you should be able to understand that the dependent variable depends on the variation of the independent variable for it to change itself. Right, let's say the two variables we are looking at is the independent variable is music and dependent variable is mood. Right, let's say your mood changes as you listen to music. So now we can say that the independent variable called music has had an effect on the dependent variable called mood, which means your mood depends on music for it to change. So a hypothesis contains these two things, a dependent and a independent variable. But apart from this, you will also have to identify the third type of variable called external variables. External variables are other elements that might affect the dependent variable, not the independent variable. There is absolutely no connection between the independent and the external variables. External variables are applicable only to the dependent variable. For example, I cannot just say, when I'm doing my experiment, I can't just talk about how music is the only factor that changes my mood. Maybe I'm listening to music, but probably in a much comfortable, very convenient atmosphere. Let's say the ambience is really nice. The setting, the lights, and then let's say the temperature is perfectly set. It's nice and cozy, and like the lights are perfect, and maybe that is affecting my mood, and I will misunderstand and probably misinterpret my data saying music has affected my mood. But in reality, maybe it was the lights that changed my mood, or maybe it was my mood before coming into that room. Maybe my mood was already good. You never know. So these are all external variables. So as a researcher, you have to build a relationship between an independent and a dependent variable and eliminate all the external variables. That's how you construct a hypothesis. Now, that is about quantitative research, guys. When it comes to qualitative research, you will have to have a bunch of research questions. You cannot have a hypothesis, because we are not just trying to build a relationship between two objects. We are here to investigate. Quantitative research is not investigative, right? It's primarily to do with trying to establish a relationship between the variables. Here, we are going to have to investigate using research questions. Now, if you have to start an investigation with anything, any damn thing, you will always start with a bunch of questions like, where do I start? What do I do with what I have started? And how do I take it further? These steps become your research questions. So when you have to construct research questions, you will have to remember, where will you want to start? The point that you want to start at will be your initial establishing research question. Now, apart from this, generally, if you've looked at even like master's level research, you will notice that they will have at least 3 to 4 research questions, which is like a minimum amount of research questions required to conduct your research, right? On the other hand, when you're talking about quantitative research, you will have just one hypothesis. Some people have 2 hypotheses, right? Hypothesis, SIS, singular, SES, plural. Please remember, hypotheses is a plural. Now, this is like the basic knowledge you'll need to know in terms of quantitative and qualitative. Now, in the same context, you'll also have 2 ways to approach your research: inductive and deductive. Inductive and deductive approaches we have already discussed in the context of 2-step flow theory of Paul Lazarsfeld, but I'll still talk about it to you. Inductive research is where you are trying to induce a certain amount of knowledge, right? Which means you are trying to present and produce new knowledge, new information that was not existing before. It did not need a discovery. It's basically this. In physical sciences, you talk about 2 things, right? Invention and discovery. Discovery is basically discovering what already existed. Invention is inventing something new by creating a mixture of a bunch of things. So you cannot invent you cannot invent bacteria. Bacteria already exists, you just discover it. But you can invent a light bulb by conducting a bunch of experiments and doing a lot of permutations and combinations. You have a light bulb, right? So that's the difference. Same logic with inductive and deductive. Deductive, you just gather a bunch of content, you investigate the content using qualitative research tools, and then you come down to your analysis where you have now deduced certain knowledge. Here you're inducting certain knowledge into a research gap that already exists. Talking about research gap, you will need to understand what is a research gap from a perspective of research, from the review of literature logic. Basically, once you're done with your introduction chapter, you'll immediately move to your second chapter called the review of literature. What happens with review of literature basically is you're going to identify the research gaps in all these research papers. Research gap is where you identify what areas have not been covered. That becomes your research gap. So basically, let's say I have an ocean full of colored stones, right? Let's say there are like multicolored stones inside the ocean. As a diver, scuba diver, I will go doing my research on different colored stones, and I'll keep gathering these stones, right? So let's say I have gathered 10 colors right now, and there's so many more colors left. All the colors I have gathered is the research knowledge. All the stones I have not gathered, that remains untouched and waiting to be explored, that becomes the research gap. And every researcher who's trying to engage with new research is trying to fill that research gap that exists within the ocean, right? So you need to understand research gap concept when you're talking about review of literature, and research gap is very important for you to like understand when you're doing research. So that being said, let's just quickly jump to a few new research methodologies that you probably have not heard of, and the ones you've already heard of, I'll just quickly tell you, talk about them first, and then and introduce you to about 4 or 5 new research methodologies, and then we'll just conclude this lecture, right? So I'm sure you guys are already aware of the survey method, the most basic, most important type of method. Survey method is where you create a questionnaire and administer the questionnaire on a population, on your sample. Talking about sample, I think you'll already probably know that there are different types of sampling methods. Please go through all the sampling methods. You'll find a lot of videos on YouTube. You don't even have to waste your time sitting and reading up on sampling methods. Just go type sampling methods in social sciences and you'll get a lot of different videos. Just watch a couple of them, watch one of the most popular ones, and you are set with sampling method. Trust me, you can apply the same logic for PhD also. You don't really have to sit, I mean, you'll have to read a textbook for the sake of bibliography, but you don't have to really sit and break your head about reading all the different types of sampling methods, right? So talking about the different aspects of sampling, you have your sample size, which is the number of people you're choosing or number of objects you're choosing for analysis. Population is the actual number of people who exist in a particular city. And then sampling technique is what method you're using to pick these people. This you probably already know, but just a little bit of information, extra information for you, right? So I was talking to you guys about survey method. So when I'm doing the survey method, I will administer my questionnaire to my sample and get the data that I'm looking for. Now apart from survey, you probably already know in-depth interview methods, where you conduct an interview. There are different types of interviews. Please take a look at them. Then you have the focus group discussion, where you, instead of an interview where there's just one person you're talking to, you put a bunch of other people, 4 or 5 people, and get them all to talk to each other. And while they're talking to each other, you're taking down notes and you're doing your observations. You have your content analysis. Now under content analysis, there's again different types. There's textual analysis, there's visual analysis, there's color analysis. There's a lot of things, right? But all of this falls under the purview of content analysis. Then you've probably already come across, these are the popular methods. Now I'll introduce you to some more other methodologies that you are probably not aware of, and even if you're aware of, maybe you have not really tried experimenting with these methods, right? The one very important method that I've already spoken to you guys and introduced it when I was talking to you guys about Carl Hovland, the experimental persuasion method. In this method, it's called the experimental method. This is a method that we have borrowed from the field of psychology, where we have 2 different groups, the control group and the experiment group, and then we conduct our experiments. Even Seymour Feshbach, the guy who gave catharsis, which is another thing I have already taught you, right? Even Feshbach used the experimental method. So that you probably know the experimental method already, because I have done it in one of my previous videos, but please do read up on that if you're not sure. I'm sure you've come across this method, but probably never tried it out. It's called it's from the field of anthropology, where we are trying to study people by going into their environments and observing them based on just how they behave and how they talk to each other. This process is called ethnography. Remember ethnic studies? Ethnography. Ethnography is basically studying behavioral patterns, communication patterns, and other social structures of a particular community by observing, not by talking to people, just sitting there, watching them on a daily basis and observing. Now within ethnography, there are 2 advancements. One is autoethnography method. Autoethnography method is now becoming very popular, where you're observing yourself, your own behavioral patterns in the society, right? On a daily basis, you have a tool called diary keeping, right? So basically take notes of how you're carrying yourself out. Let's say your research is on how academic labor works. Let's say that's your research area. So you're trying to understand how you work as a teacher. you can use autoethnography method and just talk about how you conduct yourself in your work environment when you become a teacher. Take down notes and use these notes as your data for your conclusion. So that's autoethnography. Then there's another thing called cyber ethnography. These are two emerging areas in research methodology. Cyber ethnography is where I am studying behavioral patterns, communication patterns, societal structures, etc., but not in real communities, but on the cyber world, the internet world, the digital space, right? That is cyber ethnography. So this is probably one research methodology you're not aware of. Another very important research methodology for you all to know is factor analysis. Factor analysis is one of those very complicated methodologies but very commonly used. Factor analysis is when you have a bunch of factors. We were talking about external variables in the context of hypothesis, right? So in the same logic, when we are talking about factor analysis, we are not taking only these two variables, we are taking a bunch of other things, right? And we are going to create a matrix. It's very complicated when you try it, but to understand it's not really complicated. Now I am talking about how my mood is affected because of music, right? So in a regular normal survey research, I'm just going to create a bunch of questions about do you feel good when you listen to music? Agree, strongly agree, disagree, whatever. What kind of music do you like? Such questions, very straightforward questions. But when I'm doing factor analysis, I will break down music into its separate parts. I will break down mood into separate parts, both the variables, right? And I will build a matrix. A matrix is a bunch of boxes in which you are trying to create a relationship between each factor. Now let's say music has been broken down into lyrics, music, the musical value in itself, the tempo, the tone. Let's say I have 5 different elements of the music, and in my emotions I'll probably put sad, happy, whatever, right? So now for each one of these rows and columns, I will try and find data and fill these boxes and then use statistical methods to come to my conclusion. That is a factor analysis method. It's a little more complicated than your survey method. Another very important method that you'll have to know is critical discourse analysis, CDA, right? It's becoming very, very popular today, and it's very constantly talked about in different research methodology sessions. Critical discourse analysis is the same thing as your content analysis. However, you are not going to just look at the data that you have gathered. You can watch a lot of videos on critical discourse analysis. You'll understand better. I think I will not be able to do justice to it as much as these other lectures can, but basic idea of critical discourse analysis is to take any statement or a text or a paragraph, etc., from different media platforms, and then critically analyzing it with connection to ideologies. The ideologies could be political or could be social or economical or whatever, but you place certain textual content within the framework of ideologies, and that becomes critical discourse analysis. There's a very elaborate process of doing critical discourse analysis, but the basic logic is this. Now apart from that, I'm sure you guys are aware of the coding process, but I'll still tell you, coding process basically looks at each text. You take 5-6 paragraphs, or you take 20-30 comments and break it down into codes. This process is called coding method. After you break it down into codes, you build a sort of a connection between each of these codes. That's the coding method. You have to probably you're already aware of it, or if you're not, then you'll have to explore this. It's also called as thematic analysis. Thematic analysis is another tool which is very commonly used. That's probably one of the research methodologies I'm going to be using for my PhD research. In thematic analysis, what we are trying to do is use a theoretical framework and fill your theoretical table, right? You have a theoretical table. Let's say you're using something as simple as Noam Chomsky's 5 filters of modern propaganda we had spoken about long ago: ownership, advertising, sourcing, flack, and the market, the audience. Now I have 5 categories. I take about let's say 50 comments 50 different comments on a political page like BJP's official page, and I categorize each comment into one of these filters, Noam Chomsky's modern propaganda filter, right? Once I have filled them, I will now hunt for themes. I will start categorizing this using a method that is called chunking, right? Using chunking method, I will categorize all of these and then introduce new themes for my consumers of my data. That is thematic analysis, right? So these are some important methods you guys will need to know. Now if I think of some more methodologies that you should be aware of, I'll just put it up in the form of a voice note or a text message on the group. But this is like an overview of research methodology. There's a very simple, very easy to understand video that I have put up on YouTube. I have already shared the link with you guys on how to measure, how to understand measures of central tendency, which is the mean, median and mode, which is the backbone of statistics. Please do watch it and see if you can make sense of how it works. There might not be too many questions on statistics, but it's always good to know because you never know where they'll ask you a question from. I am going to upload the next video on development communication also in some time. I'll see you guys.